Well, and first of all, I just want to say congratulations and thank you for writing such a beautiful book. I found it incredibly moving and just kind of echoing what Neil was saying. You know, it really resonated with me and reminded me of the experiences of lots of people that I know, people in my family, and I'm sure that other people that read it will feel the same. Perhaps to start, you could just tell us, you know, how this book came to be and why you wanted to write it.
Okay. What really caught my attention very early on was, I suppose I had a hankering for a type of childhood autonomy. I had a recollection of something that I thought was commonplace once, but doesn't seem to exist so much now, whereby relatively young children determine how they were going to spend their after-school time. And it's something that came to me once, and I thought, isn't that interesting? That doesn't happen so much now. And with that came a number of other things flowed from that. So I ended up with these two children who spent their time just knocking about and falling out. And from that scenario, I then had a sense of their home life, a sense of the norms in a society where children could do that, and just followed them home and got into that dynamic, and then discovered what the family life was like, the wider community life was like. So yeah, and that's pretty much the epicenter of the book. That's where it started for me, yeah.
Had this been a story, had these characters been with you for a long time? Because obviously you've come to writing this novel after a career, you know, various careers in other and totally other fields. Was this, you know, where did it kind of spring from? What was that kind of initial impetus?
I'd say that Wheeler was with me for a while. I love Wheeler's character. I love her courage. She is very brave. I loved her curiosity about the world. And as well, there's a kind of compassion to her that drew me to her. And she needed a companion. She needed this other character who, in many respects, acts as a kind of guide through the questionings that Wheeler has about the world, about the tensions in the family house. So it was those two primarily. And I had a ton of other people in it who fell by the wayside over time because really they weren't at the heart of the story. A few of them came back in different guises, but yeah, essentially it was Wheeler, yeah.
You know, the thing that for me, the kind of central, that kind of sense of play and freedom, and as you say, the kind of like the idea of kids just sort of roaming free, is a kind of massive part of the book. But also is this sense of longing and yearning. Wheeler has been left in the Caribbean by her mother, who's gone to England in search of work, and this is a story that is familiar, particularly in the context of the kind of the Windrush generation and our kind of growing awareness of colonialism in the British Empire and how it's impacted families. But in a sense, most people's associations with Windrush is like the moment that people arrived in Britain, and not many people think about the people that were left behind. Was that an important element for you?
It was, well, for me, in telling the story, it was an inevitable part. What I've been struck by since people have read the book, and it's only been released officially, I think, this month, a few people have read it prior to publication, is how surprised people have been about that aspect of this Windrush story, this migration story, which I don't think perhaps it hasn't been told as often as the story in this theatre, in this arena. So there's a lot of curiosity about that, which did strike me as odd, because I assumed everyone knew that these people didn't spring up from the center of the earth. I mean, they came from these beautiful places, and almost always from relatively small, very socially integrated communities. And so ultimately, in describing their lives and depicting those places, I think it plays a very important role in the telling of their stories, if only in that it shows indirectly how traumatic alienating the initial contact with England would have been. And most of the people who came ended up in the urban centres of England, and that would have been incredibly jarring. So yeah, I was very surprised that there wasn't that level of awareness.
I know just from the experience of my own family that there were people who were left behind and then sent for, but I think within the family there was a sense that that just happened to us. That was a unique experience, and it was only through kind of exploring, through other projects I was working on later, that I realised this was kind of widespread across families. It wasn't just specific to us, and the impacts of that dislocation and separation was also not specific to us. This was actually a kind of a cultural phenomenon. And you've spoken about, it's not just the people that get left behind, but is this the beauty of the island culture that gets left behind as well. And as we all know, this kind of journey to England for a better life, in that kind of telling of the story, we're not often thinking about the riches that were left in the Caribbean and the family connections too.
Absolutely, and I think so. There isn't a conversation Wheeler has with anyone outside of her family which in some way doesn't reference the absence of her mother, and I think that's because the experience was quite commonplace. People had themselves lost relatives to migration. So certainly from that perspective, it was a widespread phenomenon, and they really did miss the ones who left quite deeply, and as I say, it resonated throughout a community.
That might lead us quite nicely into your first reading.
Okay.
Yeah, if you'd like to.
Well, the first reading has to do with the method by which people left the Caribbean. And we all know about Windrush. Well, Windrush was one ship, and there was a constant series of journeys made by people. Okay. Yeah, this sets the stage really for the feelings of longing and loss experienced by the central character and as well the wider community. Eyes quickening, she went down the stairs and out into the yard. As the banana boat approached, a reminder of her mother, more brutal than a Christmas paper chain. The ship's prow pointed at the harbour like a primed weapon. A tugboat glided portside. Puffs of black smoke belched into the still morning air. Too early even for Celeste, Wheeler stood alone on the edge of the retaining wall in her thin nightdress. Carrying a cargo of bananas and passengers from neighbouring islands, all bound for England, the freighter nosed its way towards the harbour. The letters G-E-E-S-T emblazoned along its hull. The ship came fully into view, blocking the mouth of the bay as the last of it edged around the cliff. The tiny figures on the tug watched it go. The memory of her mother's departure overwhelmed her. How she inside could pain so? Wheeler looked away. Celeste appeared, tying together her house dress. Wheeler's eyes implored Celeste as if to say, "Look." "You come back," she muttered as Celeste nudged her into the house and settled her on a kitchen stool. Celeste looked off to the sink window, still straightening her clothes. "You gon' keep coming back," she said, as if to herself. A length of string fastened around her meagre waist. She went back out into the yard. Small ribcage contracting, Wheeler stayed where she'd been placed by Celeste. The uneasy stillness of the morning was soon cut through by the sounds of the feeding chickens chuckling out in the yard. She could no longer see the banana boat as it continued to dock. She gazed across the counter to the headland. Coconut trees glistened here and there, their upheld branches like static windmill blades. Willie's eyes fell to the shore. 2 vehicles made their way round. One a red and white van, white on top, red at the bottom. The distance was such that she saw them in miniature. She was sometimes able to make out people she knew as they made their way around. But there wasn't anyone walking along now. All day long, little country trucks would bump their way around Wharf Road, heaped with green bananas, on their way to the port. Then, later that night, somebody's brother, sister, father, someone else's mother would carry luggage to the harbour and climb the gangway to be carried away by the banana boat.
Beautiful. And in that, we get a sense of how descriptive the book is, and there's a real vivid sense of place, and yet, you know, you've made a decision not to kind of name the island, right? You've talked about the fact that the book is set in Caribbean everywhere. Could you tell me about why you did that?
Okay, I'd probably hone it down a bit to Caribbean any place, in that everywhere implies that everywhere in the Caribbean is the same. And we know that not everywhere is the same, but there is a commonality in the language, in the landscape, and the customs, and also in that shared experience of migration, in particular migration to England. So what is happening for Wheeler and what has happened to her family could have happened and did happen anywhere in the Caribbean. Yeah. So I didn't think it was necessary to name one location. I thought it encompassed an area, a region, and a time.
How did that kind of come in then when you were thinking about language? Because as Neil mentioned, you know, you're using Caribbean English or patois in the book to represent the character's speech and kind of Wheeler's interior world. And you know, it's an oral dialect, right? There's no kind of standard way of writing it down. Was it challenging to get it down on the page? And how did you, in terms of that kind of Caribbean any place, how did you work that out in trying to get it down?
Right, I agree with you. There is no one standardized way of either speaking or representing Caribbean English. And that's part of its strengths in a way. The origins of these dialects is very, very specific. I mean, these were the response of enslaved people to the ravages of the transatlantic slave trade, the utter decimation and erasure of their own languages and culture. And having been enslaved, the very people who had taken that from them, well, in the process of eliminating those languages, forbid them to speak anything but English. So people assume the Caribbean to be a unified unit. It wasn't. People existed in isolation from each other. So the response, the way the English they were allowed to speak was adapted and used by the people who, many of them, didn't have the same language in order to communicate with each other and the slave owners. The ultimate outcome of that was variety. It was inevitable. So the book doesn't aim to say this is the only form of Caribbean English. It very much stems from a type of response that I am familiar with. I mean, I call it my mother tongue, because I was born in Grenada, and that is the sound I hear, and it's only relative to writing this book that I hear so clearly this sound. Because as you probably guessed, I grew up in the UK and in North America. I grew up in Canada as well as America, and as well as London. So whenever I'm in the Caribbean, I'm terrified. I never try to pretend to speak Caribbean English, because I'm always called out on that, because my pronunciation is terrible. My vocabulary is iffy. So I was amazed when I started to write this that the sounds came back to me. And I know they are genuine to Grenada, because that's, as I say, I hear that sound, and I hear it when I speak on behalf of the characters and for Wheeler in the book, yeah.
Did it feel like kind of reconnecting to a kind of lost part of yourself, or a part of yourself that you'd left behind, if it had been that long since you'd spoken that language?
Do you know, yes and no. I always knew what I was inside, but I could never vocalize that. And that connection between what I am and what I can say and hear on behalf of the characters was really fantastic. It was a nice feeling to feel that integrated again, yeah.
Could you tell me about the choice to kind of represent, or to have that kind of omniscient narrator represented in standard English? Because there are kind of these three strands, or three layers when you're kind of reading the book, of the kind of speech marked bits of speech from the external characters, Wheeler's internal kind of dialogue, which is also in the same dialect, and then the omniscient narrator who describes place and moves the narrative on. But that is in standard English.
Yeah. The standard English narrator, for me, served at least two purposes. Firstly, to establish a contrast that allowed the heightened awareness of this, the nuances and the type of intricate cadences of Caribbean English is better heard when contrasted against standard English. Mm. So there was that aspect. And there's also the sense of making the book more accessible to more readers. Whereas in the Caribbean, everybody understands standard English. It's what's taught in school, it's what's used in formal settings. So in a way, they are bilingual, but the standardized bits of the book takes account of the fact that that type of awareness isn't universal. People on the outside don't necessarily understand Caribbean English. So the narrator serves that purpose also, as well as standing as a contrasting element. It's also a way of making sure that a wider audience can actually enter that world. Because it's a collaboration, very much so, between Wheeler and the narrator. Mm. At times they even finish each other's sentences. Yeah? Mm.
I wanted to sort of pick up on what Neil was saying earlier about the way in which you kind of inhabit Wheeler's perspective, because there's something quite impressionistic about the way that you write, and I think it is that you are kind of just getting this kind of this wash of images and events kind of happening, and you're sort of experiencing through Wheeler's eyes, not necessarily understanding what is happening. You do that really, really well. There are these kind of moments of revelation where Wheeler suddenly makes sense of what these kind of complex adult dynamics that she's witnessing, where she realizes, oh, adults don't always tell the truth, and you're kind of with her as she has these revelations. But I was, was it? It must be difficult while you're writing to sort of unknow and unsee and understand, and to kind of really try and occupy that kind of innocent perspective of a child in a complex and conflict-ridden adult world.
Well, what I say in response to that is that, first of all, Wheeler has these terrific traits. I mean, she's courageous, she's compassionate, and she's extremely curious. So starting from that perspective, the unknowing was relatively easy. It's, what does a child, say, I don't know, between 7 or 10 years old doesn't know or does know? And so she sets out in this new household to try and figure out, why is it certain people don't talk to other people? And why is this person behaving that way, and it's allowed for them to behave that way, and so on. So there's an outer side to that questioning, and she poses those questions regularly to her older sisters, who aren't very reliable, by the way, in terms of how they respond, but also to her cousin, who's her age, and they have a similar perspective on the world. And then occasionally she just intuits things. And the beauty of that inner voice, and again, it being authentic and her own voice, I think it does something for the reader in that they share that revelatory moment with her. And it's really, in a way, it's extremely, I think it's it's what I was hoping to do with the book, keep the voice of the characters authentic, and also make it a way of entering deeper into that world. So yes, it was difficult, but ultimately, if you are in the head of a child that age, there are obvious things that adults take for granted that they will keep on questioning. Yeah.
One of the things, I mean, as I mentioned, I found the book very, very moving, and you really get this sense of Wheeler, her this yearning for her mother, and this kind of loss and grief, and her in this kind of hostile, sometimes violent domestic environment where there's a kind of looming threat, and then there's the threat of the people around her, and then there's the threat of the fear of the dark and the spirits and the jumbies that are in the forests outside. And yet there's also a lot of joy in the book as well. And you kind of talked about this as something that you wanted to kind of consciously strike a balance between the joy and the loss.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm going to do a reading in the moment which taps into that a little. And just before I go into it, I just want to, there is the joy. It comes often from the interaction between characters who are in conflict with each other. So it's unintentional laughter as well. But just before I give an example of that, I'm just going to describe the setting of the novel. And the terrain plays a big part in the novel, which is set mainly around St. Catherine's Bay, which is a fictional location. And that bay is surrounded by an arena of hills, which is rafted with streets and houses. And there's this colourful semicircle around the bay. So the various levels and tiers of the hills are reached via flights of outdoor steps. And so the characters are often described as either descending or else climbing up steps. There's a lot of up and down. So the flight of steps that takes us from a lower road to the family house is known as the cut. It's a very long flight of steps that cut into the slope, hence the cut, where the family house is located. So it features throughout, and it features in this piece. In the afternoon, with a brilliant display of silver water at their backs, Donnell and Wheeler scaled the rocky kitchen yard. "Where are you going?" Jonathan asked them. He was sitting at the back of the house on the gutter ledge, playing a game of marbles with a teenage boy, Bounce. Donnell answered, "We're just going up the cut." Slipping past Donnell, Wheeler went and sat down beside Jonathan. "They're still baking," she said. "We just come for something to eat." The bread and coconut buns were still in the oven. There'd be nothing to eat until supper. Hey, or you come up and make me lose my concentration," said Bounce. A gentle, sneaky grin from Jonathan. "Thank you, Bounce." Standing up, pockets jingling, Jonathan produced a red-eyed shooter from his pocket, knelt to the ground and took his turn. He lined up his shot, eyes moving from his thumb, then back as he aimed. Heels in the gutter, chins on their knees, Wheeler and Donnell watched. Half on his knees, half twisted, Jonathan launched his glass shooter at the spray of marbles, again and again, sweeping up the field. "See what all you do?" Bounce lurched forward, his eyes taking on a wild and threatening look. Wheeler gazed at Bounce, his small, neat ears, the grumpy, screwed-up expression on his face. She sat back, unconcerned. Everybody knew how Bounce do. "Okay, one more time," Bounce urged, jerking his bony head. He and Jonathan laid down an equal number of marbles on the ground. Jonathan's aim slipped. Bounce's turn. They switched back and forth. Another game lost. Bounce demanded another try. As the sparring continued, blunt afternoon heat rose up off the ground, smited Wheeler's face. An involuntary stupor descended over her. Almost asleep, she nodded herself awake. Floyd was looking down at them from his bedroom window. Saturday, half-day closing. A carpenter, apprenticed to old man Guppy by the cemetery gate. Floyd had returned home from work. He glared out the window, muscular arms bulging from his short-sleeved shirt. I thought I'd tell you stay away from this yard. Jonathan's head swung round. Floyd had his eyes on Bounce. Bounce at first ignored Floyd, intent on the game. His long, square back remained contorted where he lay, curled on the ground. Then he kissed his teeth. Shoo, man, what you causing confusion for? Floyd's head, then his torso, flew out the bedroom window. The frame struggled to contain him. Want I put my foot in your ass? Donnell fled. Wheeler stared after him. She stood up, started making her way towards the cut. Bounce uncurled himself and looked up. Okay. He held up his hand. He started separating out his marbles. Floyd said, get the hell out of here. All right. Wheeler watched as, clutching the marbles in one hand, Bounce stumbled to his feet and hauled up the seat of his short pants. A go in. Mako, she heard Floyd yell. Climbing the cut, Wheeler watched Bounce's narrow, pointed head sink deeper and deeper below her. Meanwhile, Donnell had hastened uphill and was waiting for her to the side of the lane. His blank eyes were fixed on the view. Why are you in like Bounce? She asked him. Donnell lowered his head. Bounce was always joking about. Ain't nobody in like Bounce, she said. Donnell lowered his head a notch more. Something she'd seen him do before tell him what he knew. He'd a droppy head before saying how Floyd a rap he and Jonathan crossed their head. Wheeler sat down, waiting on Donnell. He shook his head. I know. Thank you.
So you chose that reading because you felt that kind of represented some of the kind of the joyous moments in the book. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, there is an awful lot of tension in that family house. But it's tempered by a lot that goes on in the wider community. There is a celebratory aspect to life in St. Catherine's Bay, and that involves things like Carnival and the anticipation of Carnival, and much later in the book, a period after Easter, towards the end of Easter, on Easter Sunday, known as kite season. So these other events are always taking place. So there are distractions for Wheeler. Occasionally she can forget that her mother isn't there and doesn't have to keep obsessing about that. Yeah, I felt that was important in any case for the way the book evolves, but also it's a reality that there is, as Neil said, the book was originally called Custom and Practice. There are all these practices that do take place, cultural events and so on, which are beautiful in themselves and a little known, I think, outside those particular communities, and they're fascinating.
It seems, when you're sort of talking about the Caribbean English and the history of that dialect and those very dark and difficult legacies in the Caribbean, those customs and practices are about survival, and it's also how Wheeler copes and survives in the absence of her mother, as well as the community copes and survives with their loved ones who have left, and also the kind of the weight of history that looms heavy over islands, places like the imaginary St. Catherine's. Are you kind of is that a part of Wheeler's world at all? This deeper history of the Caribbean?
I think so. I think certainly in the carnival scenes, that aspect is integrated. It's just part of everyday life. It isn't in any way declaimed, except bits of carnival, which clearly have a heritage of their own. So you live in that community without questioning where things have come from, but they've come from somewhere. So at Wheeler's stage of life, that aspect doesn't so much impinge on her. It's all terribly personal. And Wheeler does a very good line in Righteous Indignation anyway. So there are aspects of what happens at kite season and so on, which are very personal to her. But clearly these things have an origin and they're rooted in that community. Yeah.
Could you say a bit more about the alternative title and what that meant and how it changed?
Well, it changed. Let's start with why it changed. And Neil's here, and he knows why it changed. My editor, he's shrinking away there in the background. It changed because I was told by Weatherglass that Custom and Practice sounds like a training manual. And people wouldn't necessarily see it on the bookshelf and think, well, that's a work of fiction. So it had to change for practical reasons. But, and I've said this to Neil and others, that in my mind, the book it's a novel of manners. So even with the title not explicitly expressing that is typified in the book by a number of rules that govern people's behavior. The rules around house clothes and outside clothes that are observed by the characters, this thing about church shoes and school shoes, and the civility between people, the way you are expected to address the adults at home, and how they greet the people when they're away from home. So if you'll allow me, I'll demonstrate that with a reading, which, again, it embodies something about the community which just happens and which, if you live in the community, you don't question. But clearly, it's an example of something that is peculiar to that community, and it isn't widespread. It doesn't happen everywhere else. So it very much feels like the night walks and a number of other things. It's part of the customs and practices of this place. Now, Wheeler needs a new church dress, because you can't go to church in an ordinary dress. You need a church dress. She's outgrown her old one. So she and her eldest sister, Adele, they set off to the home of Miss Springer, their new seamstress. When they arrived at the seamstress's house, a woman rocking a baby came and ushered them in. "Morning, morning," they answered. "That Miss Springer?" Wheeler followed Adele into the house. A long, sunless corridor pointed them to where they were going. There was a radio playing somewhere. Daylight teetered at the end of the landlocked entrance, as did the leftover smell of a meal. Morning, morning. Arriving in the spacious back room, Wheeler and Adele nodded half a dozen times to the women seated there, said morning several times more. As well as the nodding women, two figures stood to the side of a sewing machine, one with a mouthful of pins adjusting a part-finished dress. "Morning, Miss Springer," said Adele. "Oh, you come?" The woman with the pins answered. She spluttered the words. Adele and Wheeler sat down. Miss Springer's workroom was a glittering gallery of carnival costumes. The fizz and excitement of afternoon mass was right there in the long, sunny room. Wheeler's mood lifted. She'd have walked by this house every day. She didn't know they have so much of things going on in here. Adele nudged Wheeler. "Stop staring people in the eye." "How are staring people in the eye?" She didn't know where to look. The carnival costumes came to Wheeler's rescue. Waves of gold, all kinds of blue and silver and yellow. She shuffled around in her chair, taking a closer look. Blue seas and silver skies on long pants and skirts. Silver sequins getting ready to shine out in the sun. The pageantry and spark of afternoon carnival. Men and women, arms around one another, swaggering, whining, midriff showing. She squinted at Adele. What a playing! We playing 20,000 leagues under the sea, said one of the women. Another one said, Are you in come for all your costume? Adele shook her head. The profane and pious met. I getting me sister measured, for she church dress.
Yeah, when we spoke briefly on the phone yesterday and you were talking about civility and manners, it kind of reminded me of trips to the Caribbean and, you know, addressing aunties by the wrong name and visiting people in the wrong order and all these kind of, there is a kind of real rigidity in some ways, the way that you're expected to behave, especially with the elders. And that juxtaposed with the kind of freedom and abandon of Carnival and perhaps people who just come here who are not from the community who, you know, see Notting Hill Carnival or kind of receive other aspects of Caribbean culture wouldn't necessarily know about that aspect.
No, and it's like the yin and the yang. You don't really have a good handle on Carnival unless you understand the fact that it's a kind of freedom and abandoning of those protocols. And when you actually get into Carnival, you see people like school teachers and Sunday school teachers in a whole different light. Because really.
So I'll just ask a couple more and then we'll open the floor to questions. But, you know, I want to ask, to what extent is this a personal book? Because there is this kind of heartbreaking central story, and obviously you've talked about the fact that you're drawing on some of your memories and experiences in Grenada. How much of you is in the book, is in Wheeler?
Yeah, I mean, oddly enough, not so much of the longing, oddly enough. I think where I started was very much the personal part of it to me. I lived that childhood very early on of just wandering around and seemingly doing nothing for hours on end. Though in actual fact, I was communicating with the world and intuiting things about the adult world. So that bit of the book really resonates very deeply with me, yeah. This sense of a childhood autonomy, yeah.
Mm. And if there's something that you wanted people to take away, or if there was a kind of intention that you had, you know, embedded in the book as you sent it out, what would that be?
Strangely, there wasn't an intent in this. It's subsequent to the way the book's been received. I just hope it can form part of the conversations that people have about that aspect of that generation that left, the sense of people, places left behind, and the longing that then engendered, and just ultimately really just to be the catalyst for those sorts of conversations, if you will, and for just a wider understanding of what that meant for the people who were behind and the ones, obviously, who came here.
Lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And for your wonderful readings. And yeah.
Thank you, Zakia. Like I
Do we have any questions? And if we do, how are we going to do it, Kate? Or are we going to... People are going to shout? Yes.
You can come forward.
Or you can take the mic. Okay. So any questions? Go on, don't be shy. Kate's got the mic now, so someone's going to have to ask one.
Hello, Anne.
Hello, Yvonne.
Many congratulations
Thank
on
you.
your novel. I suppose I was thinking, what I'm thinking, I guess it just feels somehow like a really ripe time to be writing this kind of novel, and I want your thoughts on that, because I think back about all the the writings around the Windrush generation, the Sam Selvins, the Andrea Leavys, and many more. But I'm very aware of the unheard voices of the left behind, sometimes described in other writings as the barrel children. And I kind of wonder, in terms of your book, how important it was for you to connect as a child coming to, was it UK or Canada first? UK?
I came to the UK
to the
first.
UK to get those voices, for people to begin to hear those voices. Because I think there's a massive assumption, and correct me if I'm wrong, and anybody else who was born in the Caribbean who were not coming to join the workforce, as it were, invited or otherwise, come to try to make a better life for themselves. There's this massive assumption, I think, that every child wanted to come to England.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just kind of thinking, what are your thoughts about that, and in terms of the inspiration for writing your book and Wheeler as a character?
Okay.
That's a very long monologue.
I get it.
Yeah.
I get it. Yeah, I think first of all, there are an awful lot of assumptions about Caribbean life, and I think it's partly because the circumstances of arrival didn't allow much in the way of agency for the people who came. Nobody was interested, really. Everyone had their own fixed view, often quite negative views, as to why you shouldn't be here. And from that flowed all sorts of ideas about what you'd left behind. And I think there was often a wrong view that the adults even wanted to come. I don't know that that was universal. I think it was an incredible wrenching experience, as I've described the contrast in the way of life, the weather, everything. So there is this assumption that people desperately wanted to come, and a lot of it was they were compelled to come for economic reasons. Yeah. So, I mean, I've often felt there was a curious silence around this. And again, I think it's largely because Caribbean people, I think, endure stuff, and they have. There is this inside-outside thing. People talk about this in private, but it's not something... They intuit that nobody wants to hear this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier, I was struck by the degree of interest there was in this. I think that's relatively new. I don't think people were that fussed about where you came from. They didn't want to hear, frankly. So I think it's as much a change in the wider culture. There is that curiosity now.
Mm.
So it fits in, it chimes with that greater awareness and appreciation, I think, and on the part of the host community. Yeah,
I agree. I think that the trauma of the experiences for many people were there, but there didn't seem to be a medium in which those conversations could happen. I think there are conversations that were very difficult to have with, for example, the parental group, the Windrush generation, because they had gone through so much. I think it was just so much trauma they couldn't even speak, literally, and they had to be getting on with working and doing all kinds of ghastly jobs. So those conversations, I think, just sat, and it seems like somehow now in 2024, 2020, 29, these conversations begin to happen. Thank you. It's a beautiful book. Thank you.
Thank you, Yvonne.
Sorry, nepotism.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the readings, and I've really enjoyed this evening. And what struck me is because my brothers were left behind and sent for, and when they came to England, they really hated my guts because they'd been left behind, and they saw me as being in the bosom of the family. And I wonder if there's another story to be told about the people who were left behind meeting up with the people who were born in England, and that whole it sounds like another book, because it was really quite difficult, you know. And like someone's already mentioned, they didn't talk about what happened to them when they were in, it was Carriacou, in fact. They didn't talk about what happened to them. And they were strangers to me. You know, and yet we're all meant to carry on like brothers and sisters. You know, that's a whole other book, isn't it? But I just wanted to hear your views on that.
I know it's a common enough experience, and it's not just that, okay, you had an experience where they resented the children who were born here, or I don't know if maybe you went ahead of them.
I was born in...
You were born here, yeah.
Yeah,
So I think, you know, the circumstances were rife for resentment and anger. And I think there's trauma was mentioned, and the thing about Caribbean culture is that people don't really view the world or themselves in that way. So they hold a lot of stuff and they carry the stuff around. And you still hear people say, I was expected to do this, or I was expected to feel this when I came to England, and I didn't feel that. And I came to a household with a parental figure I didn't remember, my mother or my father. I didn't know who these strangers were. So I don't know what the consequences are. I mean, we all know in terms of general knowledge about trauma, we know a lot more now, but I do know those things do have an impact on people's lives. So I don't know your personal circumstances, but I'm sure it must have affected the ongoing relationships within your family.
Definitely.
Yeah. And that's a common enough Caribbean, well, a Windrush generation experience. Let's be careful that we don't assume that's the only aspect of Caribbean life. Yeah, but from this perspective in the UK, I think there's a lot of unresolved trauma, but people not talking about things like that. They just wanted to get on and have a happy family life.
Yeah. And Zakia talks about the fact that, you know, we're really lucky. Like, I've been lucky enough to have therapy and God knows what else. Whereas my parents, they had to work to pay the bills, to pay the mortgage. There wasn't time for navel gazing. They just had to get on and do what they had to do. So, you know, so I don't blame them in that respect.
Okay, good evening, everyone. I think I'm really glad I'm here because I didn't know what to expect, but to expect the unexpected. So I'm glad I'm here, and I'm glad we're having this conversation, and thank you for writing this book, and I will get the book. But I did hear you talk about places that you grew up. You came from Grenada, and you lived here and Canada. But what is interesting for me is, what did you give up? Because that's a conversation that's not often talked about, what people actually gave up. It's interesting that when my parents came to this country in the 60s, they grew us, even though I was born here first generation, they grew us up Caribbean. And we became a bit confused as to who we were. And so I can relate to what this lady's saying, that, and when they brought out these forms where you had to tick who you were in terms of ethnicity, that further brought confusion as to who we were, because we felt like we had this schizophrenic culture. We were raised in the at home you're Caribbean, but in growing up in the world, school and your friends, it's British. So for me, it'd be interesting to find out, what did you give up, and what culture did you take up? Because I'm sure it's a hybrid of some sort. So it'd be interesting if that makes any sense. But thank you.
Okay, it's a good question. I often say to people, I'm an outlier. I'm an outsider in any assembled group. because I was born in the Caribbean, so I have knowledge of that. I have an insider's view of that. And then I grew up here for a while, and then I went to Canada, and then I came back here. So it's hard for me at some level to pretend an allegiance to any one experience, because my life kept on changing. So in terms of what I gave up, I think the thing I hankered after was just stability. I just wanted to stay in the one place. I didn't want to have to keep moving. So I think that's the thing I gave up. And yeah, it's very much that. Not that I envy other people. I think there is, okay, you call it a hybrid experience, and it certainly was. You end up with a real sense of what is culturally determined. You really, when you move, especially as a child, when you move from culture to culture, you see the differences and you think to yourself certain things aren't inevitable because they're doing them differently here. So in that regard, you could actually, say travel does widen the mind, but I think I would have loved not to have had to have all those changes in my life.
But it's interesting you've called the book Pages of Sea.
Yeah.
Of the sea. So I was thinking, when we talk about culture, it's liquid. So it just says it's got movement. So it's interesting that what you describe is what I kind of imagine through what you were saying, that it's not absolute. It's liquid. So, okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Should I stand up? That's probably best, isn't it? Okay, what's it doing? Sorry. Oh, God. Hi, Anne.
Hello.
Congratulations, and thank you, Zakia, for taking the, for chairing. I was really fascinated by everything that you read and what you had to say, and it was really interesting. I could just hear this conversation building as you read, because I think that what you've written, and which I intend to buy, has really created a space for this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And I know who I have been in this conversation, and I'm first generation Black British. My mother's Guyanese, my father's Nigerian. My mother left here after 16 years, and I lived in Guyana for 9. And I was a child watching my friends, like leaving for America and for Canada and London, and being in Guyana and feeling that I was missing out on what was going on in the world out there. And something else that I thought about whilst you were speaking was those who returned, which is to say, and this is not a task that I'm handing you, but certainly it's another story that is told, and that is, I know that my mother and my aunt, before they settled with their men, they had children out of wedlock who were returned to the Caribbean and who they didn't parent because they sent them home to their grandparents, and one of my aunt's daughter became my mother's sister's daughter, and that was pretty much how their lives carried on. So the thing that I found really striking about what you said was when you spoke about that childhood innocence, because I've often looked at that childhood innocence and thought that it's quite a mercy that we can't really think about what is happening to us as children, as adults. So I think as an adult, I think about what has been done to me, and I assume some kind of agency in what I might do about it. Whereas as a child, I felt like I was just more capable of just accepting that I live in a weird, mysterious world. And that's just the way that it is until I find maturity. So what is your relationship with Wheeler? As you kind of returned to that childhood experience through her, how might you allegorize that? Was she a shield? Was she a comfort? Was she a shelter?
I think I need to clarify the fact that, thanks for the question, by the way. Okay. Yeah, to try. Okay, if I can, I'll try to address some of the points that you've made. I don't think Wheeler was a shield for me. I don't think her story was my story. My mother left the Caribbean to study in England, but my father was always present. So it isn't really my story. So it's a kind of jumping off point, if you like, away into that world. And the longing and that whole theme is in many ways reflective of a broader experience rather than it being my experience. So she isn't, I don't think I'm working through anything by virtue of telling her story. But I really appreciate the fact that in telling her story, other people can see themselves and their story, aspects of it reflected in that story. Yeah. I hope that goes somewhere to addressing the points that you made.
I just wanted to respond because I think whilst you were speaking, a lot of what was addressed.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah. Yeah.
It was like, what did the device mean to you? Ask that question.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think, just hearing the responses, in this room just reveals and kind of, just reveals the power of the story that you've told and the significance that it's going to have for a lot of people, because as we've all said, we've heard a lot about the Windrush generation, but this really opens up a new kind of aspect of that experience that needs that breath and air, that needs some light. And I think you've brought light to it beautifully. So thank you again, Anne, and thanks everyone for coming, of your questions. And
Good. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Zakia.
Sorry, me again. No, thank you very much to Zakia and to Anne and to the questions, which were obviously deeply personal and suggest that this is a book that is going to open up those conversations, which is obviously incredibly gratifying. Just to say, so on sale, because obviously I'm the publisher, and so the book is on sale at it's not out for 2 weeks, so you get it. Wait, I haven't got the audiobook. The book is £2 off and 2 weeks in advance. The audiobook is 50% off, and if you buy both, it's even slightly more discounted. I don't know what the percentage is. So you can buy one or the other or both. And then Anne will be sitting over there and signing.
Just to say very briefly, what we've done with Spiracle is a new audiobook platform, and every book we sell is shared between the publisher and Spiracle, so it's a win-win situation. I should buy 10 if I were you for your friends.
Terrific, thank you.
Oh yeah, and there's also still plenty of drink, and you're forgiven if you want to leave to check out the football, or if you're looking at your phones about the football. Yvonne?
Sorry. Just to add one thing. I just want to add one thing, perhaps for the audience here, that although as Anne's been reading the book and we've been firing questions at her, we're thinking of this as a uniquely Caribbean story. It is not. It is not a uniquely Caribbean. I mean, there are things that are unique in the book, but this is an international story, and it is a story of loss of attachments which is a really powerful thing, and that is why your book will resonate for people all over the world. So although Caribbeans will read this book, there'll be a lot of other people who are not Caribbeans who are reading your book, who will be reading your book because there are themes in this book that they will also connect with. So I think that's important to know.
Thank you, Yvonne.
Thank you. Okay, so go get drinks. If you want to buy anything, I'll be here, and then Anne will